Today is my final official Sunday with St. Paul's Church Chattanooga, and I have appreciated your warmth and hospitality as you have helped to form me as a clergy member of the Episcopal Church. The season of COVID has been an interesting time for a seminarian. If anything, it has taught me to be open to possibilities, to be flexible, and to be faithful. God uses difficult times like these to show us how remarkable, how resilient and loving and patient God's church can be. We're all trying something new and making connections in ways we don't understand yet. Thank you for being part of my journey. Today is also our last Sunday of the Christian year, the last Sunday of the season right after Pentecost, Christ the King Sunday. In one of my commentaries, it's also called the Reign of Christ. Christ the King Sunday was instituted in 1925 by Pope Pius XI in response to the tragedies of World War I and growing secularism in Europe. And as we still face chaos and division in our world that seem to be subject to the forces of darkness, we observe Christ the King Sunday to remind us that God does reign over all things, with our Redeemer, love with a capital L, and justice with a capital J will reign. Image 1, the Lord God as shepherd. Ezekiel heard the Lord God say to him, "I will search for my sheep." The Lord God is searching for his sheep. We are reminded of Jesus' parable of the lost sheep, the one lost out of a flock of 100. Ezekiel writes during the destruction of Jerusalem and the coming of the diaspora, and he has prophetic words for our times. If you look at the entire chapter 34, you can get a clearer picture of our story. See, the ruling class, the fat sheep, are much like today's oligarchs. Not a word you hear too often in terms of our own country, but I think it fits. This ruling class of politicians, corporations, and bureaucrats has set up our system and made themselves fat. These people are not tenderly caring for the weak, the sick, the injured, and the lost, but are ruling with force and harshness, says Ezekiel. It was and is systemic willful neglect. The prophet says God will rescue God's sheep from the mouths of the wicked and feed the fat ones with justice. Social media tycoons and the rulers of the gig economy are new on the scene, but they seem just like the old tycoons of old with little regard for the other. Go back and think of industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford, or those of communist regimes in the Cold War. Economies are set up to benefit the powerful. Like in ancient Israel, the uber-rich and the powerful that pay people to walk the halls of government are marginalizing more and more and more people who are barely getting by and who are, for the first time in their lives, calling on local charities such as metropolitan ministries to make ends meet. The middle class in our country is shrinking, and I read the other day that the median price for a home in the U.S. is nearly, catch this, $313,000. COVID has turned our world inside out, literally. I know a young man who has decided that for the time being during COVID, he's living his best life and listening to what God is saying to him. Now he's young. He served the United States Navy for 4 years, and he's earned the title of man. He tried college, no go. He was miserable. Now this person is living free from the encumbrances of modern life, except for the technology that allows him to make a living. He's a seeker and desires not to be enslaved by the modern world as he sees it. At least for a time, he will be free of the harshness of the modern world, as harsh as it can be. His days will be spent in the love for and appreciation of the world that God has given us, living as closely to the earth and creating community where he runs. It is as close to any of us can get to the garden right now. Here's another image for today. Christ in his glory, sitting on his throne of glory with all the angels around him. Sit on that. The Son of Man, the King, Jesus, reigning over creation in apocalyptic fashion and making the judgment of who is saved and who is to spend eternity in damnation with no middle ground in between. The scene makes us think about our choices. Sheep over there, goats over there. In the Hebrew Bible, there's a condemnation of the system and justice for those who benefit, and worse than that, throw the rubbish of those that they neglect on top of them. In the morning prayer confession in church publication called Enriching Our Worship, it speaks of evil done on our behalf. These are systemic sins. We can do some things to change the big things, and that is good. Big things need to change. In Matthew, the judgment is personal. The sheep ask what exactly they did to earn the kingdom. The goats asked what they missed. That's interesting. The Son of Man takes inventory. Perhaps God's kingdom is so focused on creating people of God whose first instinct is to help others and to offer a drink to the thirsty. Maybe this God is looking for people to be so full of God's righteousness that righteousness just overflows like a waterfall. God's bounty is so great that once we begin the process of forming ourselves, being hearers and doers of the gospel, that our charity is natural. It becomes who we are, and we can't help it. Jesus is our perfect model, a king who was a sojourner, who showed us how to live a kingdom-like life by honoring the poor, the widow, the orphan, the prisoner, the sick, by honoring them with love and tenderness. And like the prophet Ezekiel, he pointed to the sinful practices of the oligarchy, promising that justice will be their next meal. Jesus will sit on that judgment seat asking us, did you feed and water my sheep and goats? Did you visit those in prison or at home during COVID, when COVID feels like a prison? Did you care enough to welcome and then clean and bind the wounds of the sojourner in our midst? It's a checklist. It's a sort of a checkup. We can take heart in knowing that we can affect people in direct ways. The kingdom building has an impact not only on the receiver, but as importantly, it affects the giver. It forms and transforms our souls into that whose total world is binding those of wounds and feeding the hungry. Jesus, our model of living and loving our best life by loving our neighbor and loving our God, is our King. The Son of Man will make things all right, freeing us from our sin. He proved through his own death that he is beside us in our struggles, sharing in our suffering and our miseries. Jesus is our King who makes all things right through love. And as we move into the season of Advent, may we spend time anticipating Jesus' arrival. May we anticipate and wonder of his love.